So at the start of the year, I did 2 or maybe even 3 videos on the infamous IndyCar split, which I like to refer to as being the Monday Night Wars of racing. Now, if you don't know what the Monday Night Wars was, it was the sort of mid to late 90s ratings battle between WWF, the World Wrestling Federation, and WCW, these 2 professional wrestling organisations. But what if I was to sit here and tell you the story of how Formula 1 almost went the same way, with terms and conditions? I've been doing bits and pieces recently on the FISA FOCA War as a series within a series, and it has been quite interesting to read about, and the whole political wrangling that went on behind the scenes is, well, interesting. But in the early 1980s, the tensions reached a point where the vast majority of the teams would have just naffed off and formed their own series instead. So for this, we go to the weekend of the 1st of June 1980, which was the Spanish Grand Prix, but in reality, it starts just a tiny bit earlier than that, because it had been rumbling on in the background in 2 of the previous rounds of that same season. Now, like I've said in previous videos, nobody knows exactly what kicked off this war, but it's thought that it was because FOCA, representing the independent teams like Lotus, McLaren, Williams, Ligier and Acela, believed that FISA, the autonomous subcommittee of the FIA, was being far too biased in favour of the 3 manufacturer teams, which were Ferrari, Alfa and Renault. So in response to this bickering, Max Mosley, who was one of the founders of the March team and also FOCA's lawyer, discovered some holes in the rulebook that he could exploit. At the start of the 1980 season, Jean-Marie Balestre, who was appointed the head of FISA by the FIA, said that there would be a compulsory 45-minute driver briefing prior to the start of the race weekend. But Mosley had found out that there was nothing that said that drivers were actually required to attend these briefings in the regulations. So naturally, Max advised his drivers not to attend. Some drivers missed the drivers' briefing in Belgium and some missed them in Monaco. Some missed both of them, some missed none of them. But if a driver did miss a driver's briefing, Balestre would fine that driver $2,000. If he missed another one, he'd be fined $5,000. And to show that he was serious, if Balestre never received fine payments, then drivers would get their super licenses taken away from them. And in total, 15 drivers were threatened with this license revocation. I'm just going to make up words today. Those drivers included Elio De Angelis, Mario Andretti, Alan Jones, Emerson Fittipaldi, Jacques Lafitte, Jean-Pierre Jarier, Didier Pironi, Alain Prost, Jan Lammers, Tiff Needell, Nelson Piquet, Carlos Reutemann, Keke Rosberg, John Watson, Riccardo Zannino, Derek Daly, Jochen Mass and Riccardo Patrese. Now, as a footnote here, as I mentioned, some of those drivers missed both briefings. Some were present at just Zolder, some were present at just Monaco, some missed Monaco but were at Zolder. I think you get the gist of all the variations that are possible here. It has to be assumed that only 3 drivers in Prost, Andretti and 1 other paid the fines, because just before the Spanish Grand Prix, FISA had ordered the suspension of 15 super licenses, which would have meant very few cars on the grid for the Spanish Grand Prix. In that list of drivers, there was 18 listed. FISA had also implemented rules on the sly that said that any mid-season driver changes had to be run past FISA well in advance, which in the event of license suspension would have stopped the FOCA teams getting last-minute replacements. And there was also another rule which they invoked on that race weekend in Spain that we'll get to in a minute. FOCA then said, okay, we won't bother turning up, enjoy your non-championship race, which, annoyed FISA, but at the same time annoyed the Real Automobile Club de España, which we will just call the race. Not the race, my boys over at the race, but the Spanish RAC or the Spanish AAA, depending on which side of the Atlantic you live on. The race was showing the same concerns that would have been shared in South Africa when the drivers barricaded themselves in a Joburg hotel and started singing Kumbaya around the campfire. They had spent a lot of money on putting on this race, and it was either going to be a 6-car shit show or a non-event altogether. This was a big deal for them, so the whole thing went to the top. The very top. The King of Spain got involved. King Juan Carlos only got involved after the race offered to pay any of the outstanding fines to FISA, but Balestre refused to accept the money because he had no proof that the money was coming from the teams. The money had to come from the teams and all the drivers, and, not the King of Spain, and this is where that rule we'll get to later comes in. No constructor or association of constructors may organise or be associated with a national sporting authority or club affiliated to that ASN, which is French for Automobile Sporting Authority, for the organisation of a Grand Prix. And because the race and therefore the King of Spain were, in Balestre's mind, associating themselves with the FOCA teams, no money could change hands. So in response, King Juan Carlos bypassed the Spanish motorsport authorities, who were the ones affiliated with FISA. As the race was going ahead without FISA sanctioning, it was a non-championship round and therefore no requirements were needed for a super license. Which means that Mosley's point after the 1982 San Marino Grand Prix of, yeah, but in 1980 the race went ahead despite blah 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 blah, wasn't exactly true. Maybe he'd just forgotten that the whole thing had happened that way. I don't know. The race was won by Alan Jones, and all the cars present were powered by 4 DFE engines. Only 6 cars finished, and afterwards the FIA was not happy with the Spanish authorities. But the race had said they'd notified FISA that delegation of the race had changed from the FEA to the race, and the whole thing had been done within the time frame that the FIA set for announcing that swapping of delegation, if that makes any sense. So later that year, Bernie announced the formation of the World Federation of Motorsport, a rival governing body to the FIA, and also announced the World Professional Drivers' Championship for 1981. Now this does sound like some absolutely diabolical attempt of, I don't like this, so I'm going to form my own series or my own social media site with my own rules that I can control, but in reality, it was all just one very big expensive power play. The South African Grand Prix was supposed to be the first round of the 1981 Formula 1 World Championship season, but there was some more bickering going on behind the scenes. But this was because FISA had organised the race to be on a day that wasn't compatible with the owners of the Kyalami circuit. So after a bit of back and forth between FOCA and the Kyalami circuit, Kyalami agreed to host a race on the day that FISA had wanted the race to go ahead on. But instead of having it as a Formula 1 World Championship race, they ran it as a WFM race instead. The race was run under Formula Libre rules, which basically translated to run what you want. The cars ran ground skirts, which were illegal and other aero devices banned in Formula 1, because they could, because this race wasn't run to Formula 1 regulations. But because the manufacturer teams weren't there and because the race was run as a WFM round and not Formula 1, you know, the name we all know, recognise and love, people weren't turning up. People weren't interested, and the lack of marketing and TV coverage didn't get people through the door either. It's a bit like how the 1996 Indy 500 went down. There were no-name drivers in there driving no-name cars for no-name teams. All of the big-name drivers were elsewhere, and there was that, but I want to watch Indy, but there's nobody in it I like, but I want to watch the kart race, but they're not at Indy. It's that whole juggling of things. But for Bernie and Max, it didn't matter. It showed Balestre what they were willing to do. Even if this breakaway series carried on and a lack of Ferrari meant low viewing figures, Balestre realised that if it carried on like this, he'd be left with a Formula 1 series that only had 6 cars in it, and people wouldn't want to watch that because it would be dull. So the penny finally dropped. FISA needed the FOCA teams. FOCA needed FISA. And in the midst of all this, Goodyear threatened to withdraw from Formula 1 if a compromise wasn't found. They all needed each other, so Balestre offered an olive branch. The Concorde Agreement. The document basically outlined what the teams were entitled to and what their duties were as teams to the overall running of the sport. They agreed that they were going to turn up to every race. The division of prize money was made in a much fairer way, and there was also something in there about regulations, but the vast majority of the document is confidential. Although the 1997 document did get leaked. The negotiations took 13 straight hours, and by the end of it all 13 teams in the 1981 season signed the document, named for the Place du Concorde, which is where the meeting was held. And Concorde also means together or something in French, which is, you know, why the name was given to the supersonic jet airliner. It was a collaboration, a togetherness thing between Britain and France. But this wasn't terms of surrender by FOCA, and it certainly wasn't a peace treaty either. It was merely a ceasefire, because we saw what happened at the 1982 San Marino Grand Prix and also the 1982 South African Grand Prix. But at least a IndyCar kart style split had been averted for now. So then a look at the attempted split by the FOCA-backed Formula 1 teams. Or, I mean, was it? Really? I mean, it was really just a power play. But either way, if this has been new for you and you've learned something new here today, do give the video a like. And if you're not subscribed, do get subscribed and also get that bell on so you never miss out on any future content. Massive thanks to the kind folk at Patreon, and if you do want to help support me at a more personal level, you can do so by following the link in the description, where there is also a link to things like Discord, Twitter and Instagram. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward. Have a cracking day wherever you live in the world, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. Goodbye.